been reading the Crusades. Thank you for it. So I just finished up the first volume, and through the first crusade, and what would have been the Eastern Orthodox Church's stance on it? What the empires were.
Right.
What would have been the based off the violence and
So in the Orthodox Church, there's never been a theory or theological defense of this idea of a just war.
Right.
All war is evil. All war is sinful. Anything that brings about death. I mean, there's so many. Don't even need to mention from turning other cheats, all these other things. With that being said, there has been an understanding that a defensive conflict is sometimes necessary. But again, even within that context, there's no justification. So if canonically, if a soldier kills someone in war, order may have been like Nazi camp guard, but it's still the death of someone in the image of God. So that person would still be expected to refrain from communion for a period of time. Typically, causing the death of a human is 7 years. With repentance, confession, that can be limited or shortened. But with that being said, in the case of non-clergy, there's an understanding that I will sacrifice myself. I will do what's ultimately wrong to save these people from a condition where it would be difficult for them to have that freedom to choose the right path. And so, war, I think in the East was always looked at differently in that sense. Some fathers of the church, recent fathers like St. Cyril, want to go as far as to say it's the great evil of mankind, because it's a sin that everything gets pulled into, gets sucked into. There's been periods of time in the history of the church. Without pointing fingers, you can see one example of it by turning on the Virginia News Channel, where there's been clergy that have tried to justify it, but that's really not Orthodox, right?
And of course, the West looked at it differently.
Yeah, very, very different.
I think this is, from my understanding from history, priests were underneath kings and would mentor.
Not in the East. Not in the East. Yeah. There was a New Roman Empire or East Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. It's wrongly called. He would kiss my hand. I tell that to my wife sometimes. You were the Empress of Rome, slapped to kiss me. She usually then backhands me. The beauty of married clergy is the wife helps keep us just humble. I'll start going off on some theological tangent. So just look at what she's like. I mean, I clean your underwear. Turn you back to her. But there's always, there's this idea of like a separation of church and state is a pretty modern thing. So there's always been St. Nicholas of Cavasuas, who I quoted in the sermon today. He was a layman his whole life, but he was theologian and an advisor to the emperor.
So would they encourage war?
The clergy? No, I mean, I think, a nice little illustration is in the lives of the Desert Fathers. We have two incidences. We have Abba Moses, the Ethiopian. He was a slave who started kind of this war band, and they would go around Egypt, murdering, pillaging. And he attacked a monastic settlement. And he met an elderly monk there and repented and remained there as a monk. And some other robbers had heard, he's a monk now. They're like, oh, we don't have to worry about him getting physical with us because he's one of them now. And so they went to rob the monastic settlement. And apparently he was like 7 foot, huge guy. And he just like grabbed them all, tied them all up, and sat them down. And they're like, we robbed this other monk, and he actually helped us like pack his stuff into our bags. What are you doing? You're tying us up. And he said, well, Abba Arsenios that gave you all his things, he was trying to overcome his attachment to the possessions, so you helped him. But I want my stuff. So you were sinning by stealing, and I'm preventing you from sinning. Right? And so there's, if we look at that kind of, we can expand on that, out of obedience to the gospel, I'll turn the other cheek. But there's also a time, I think, to grab that hand, maybe give it a little bit of a twist, so you don't incur another strike on you. If that makes sense. In the case of clergy, if even if it's accidental, if I, for example, driving home today, we get into a car accident, and a passenger in the other car were to die, I would no longer be able to act as a priest. So any involvement, yeah. So
For the rest of your life.
where's the rest of my life? Yeah. And again, that it's not to say that it's even a sin, but it's as a priest is an image of life giver. It's just no connection with that faith. All right, so on a lighter note, the worship cycle of the church. So I'm usually not the board guy, partly because I'm left-handed and dry erase boards are anti-left-handed. But I think it'll be easier just to kind of see. So in the Orthodox Church, there's kind of two cycles that are taking place through the year. There's 2 yearly cycles. So we'll start with the year. And these cycles, they're given kind of different names, but generally there's the movable and the immovable. I think movable feast was actually the title of the book. But anyway, so you have the movable and the immovable. Examples of the immovable would be things like that occur the same day every year, right? So everything from Annunciation, the 25th of March, Christmas, the 25th of December, all of these are from year to year will always be the same date. And so those are called the immovable. The movable is the Paschal cycle, right? Because the date of Pascha is different every year, and that's true east and west. There's a little bit of a difference to that. We're not always on the same Sunday, but that has to do with calendars, and we'll hopefully have some time to get into that. And so you have the year cycle. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove the immovable, or rather the movable cycle, and we'll talk about that in and of itself. And what we'll do now is we'll look a little bit at the year cycle of the immovable feasts, right? So the church New Year begins September 1st. So New Year's Day is September 1st. This is the Roman addiction. This was part of kind of the civil calendar. And so if we look at it, we have September 1st. The year begins. Right away, we have at the very beginning of September, on the 8th, we celebrate the birth of so we can kind of look at the life of the Virgin Mary, right? So really there's a lot of immovable feasts. Every day you look at the church calendar, such and such saint is commemorated, this church was consecrated. But really in this immovable feast, we're looking at the life of Christ, the life of his mother, and then we have a few feasts that are connected to John the Baptist. But for the most part, we'll have, the day that a saint has died or is martyred is the day that we commemorate them. There's sometimes some kind of secondary feasts connected with some of the saints, like maybe their relics, their body was transferred or there was a miracle associated with them, but generally it's just kind of a one-day thing. The life of Christ, obviously, every event in his life that's mentioned in the gospel has its own feast day, right? So the 25th of December, we celebrate the birth of Christ. The 1st of January, 8 days later, what happened 8 days later to every Jewish male? Circumcision. So there's actually the first, we usually refer to it as Saint Basil's Day. This is also the feast day of Saint Basil, but that's the secondary feast. The primary feast is the circumcision and the naming of Christ. 40 days after Christmas, beginning of March, we have or February rather, not March, March. We have the reception, the entrance of the temple. So 40 days later, we have the entrance into the temple, the presentation rather of Christ. So throughout the year, we have these feast days. The 25th of March, 9 months before the 25th of December, right? The Evangelismos, the Annunciation, the conception of Christ. And so we have throughout the year, the whole life of Christ, the whole life of the Virgin Mary. The year is kind of structured in some ways, or can be seen as being structured in the life of the Theotokos. So you have September 8th, November 21st is the entrance of the Theotokos to the temple. When she was 3 years old, she was brought to live in the temple. And then begins in September, ends in August. August 15th is really the last major feast of the church year, and that's the Chimesis, the falling asleep of the Virgin Mary. So just as the Virgin Mary, in a sense, provided the flesh that God received when he was incarnate, her life kind of creates the scaffolding of the year. So some of these movable feasts are, again, obvious, are very clear. Some of the dating may seem a little bit curious. So for example, we have in August 6th, the commemoration of the Transfiguration. Now, the gospel writings aren't real clear with dates, but if you read the gospel writings, you really get the sense that the transfiguration took place shortly before the crucifixion. In fact, tradition tells us that it took place 40 days before the crucifixion. So people are you doing, is it in August? Well, the reason why it's in August is because the exaltation of the cross is the 14th of September. And so you have the 40 days before this feast of the cross as opposed to the crucifixion of Christ. So it's one of those feast days that could have been part of the immovable, or rather the movable Paschal cycle, but it's been transferred. And the other reason why it was connected to August 6th is because that is the traditional date in ancient Greece for the grape harvest. And the grape harvest, the first fruits of the grape harvest would be brought into the church to be blessed, and the rest of those grapes would be set aside, and that would become the wine that was used for communion. And so there's kind of this natural imagery already in this historical event, right? There's a transfiguration. The wine the grape juice goes from something corruptible to something incorruptible, right? The main reason why people drank so much wine back in the day, other than the fact that it's really good, is that it lasts, right? And so they took some of that natural imagery and it was brought. And so there's so many, again, feasts, so many things connected to this kind of movable feasts. Any questions about that? So one question that a lot of times, especially Protestants will ask is, really, how do you know? And I know this because my mom is a Protestant. She often says, really, how do you know? Say, who was the first president of the United States? George Washington, right? You can ask these basic questions to people that don't even care about scandal, right? And they know, because it's a significant date. It's a significant event. Even if the majority of the Roman world was not believing, right? Why or how could someone possibly be part of the early Christian community and not remember and keep in remembrance and pass down this remembrance of these events that aren't necessarily scriptural, right? Because the scriptures, the gospel, had a very specific topic, right? That it was trying to convey. It wasn't trying to tell the entire story, right? John is very clear with that. At the very end of his gospel, what does he say? He says, everything that Christ did and said was to be written down. The world itself couldn't contain the books, right? So in some sense, I think the tradition of the church, right? Because in the Orthodox Church there is a continual 2,000-year life of the church without a break, without trying to go back to the early church, right? A living continuity, right? And there's so many examples of this. Name one of St. Paul's epistles, other than Romans. Ephesians, right? 2,000 years. 2,000 years. I mean, there is no Ephesus right now, but the remains of Ephesus are Orthodox. Right? You go to Corinth, little Orthodox churches. Right? My brother-in-law chants at a church in Thessaloniki that actually has a marking on the floor where St. Paul was when he first preached the gospel in the city of Thessaloniki for 2,000 years. So there's this lived continuity. And that tradition, that passing down, is where a lot of the events of the church calendar come along. And of course, when an event takes place, like Saint Helen finding the cross of Christ. This becomes an event, consecrations of some of the famous churches, the findings of miracle working icons or relics of the saints, all of these kind of make it in. And then of course, the church continually has saints. Right? We have a number of contemporary saints, people that at least most of us that are a little bit older in the church were actually alive when these saints passed away. People like Saint Ignatius, or not Saint Ignatius, he was born before 1921, but Saint Paisios, who I mentioned in the sermon with the American rocket ship, he died in 1992. Right, so very, very contemporary saints. And so of course their feasts are added. Any questions about this part of the calendar? Right. So I'm going to save the movable to the last. So we have the year cycle, but we also have a weekly cycle, right? And that's why we're here today, right? The weekly cycle has Sunday, right? But as part of the cycle in the Orthodox Church, we actually have a fast day on Wednesday and a fast day on Friday, right? We fast on Wednesday because that was the day that our Lord was betrayed. And we fast on Friday because that was the day that he was crucified. And this I think is actually the most ancient fast of the church. So even before the 40-day Lenten fast, before these other fasts, the weekly fast, we know this from the Didache of the 12 Apostles, was something that was considered important. And I think fasting, and we don't really have time to get into it now, is something that we have a hard time, I think, understanding its importance, its role in the life of the church. But I think if we remember that so much of this cycle, whether it's the yearly, monthly, or daily cycle, is a rhythm. Right? Like a rhythm, it's repeated from year to year. When you repeat a rhythm or a melody, it becomes second nature, right? It becomes part of you in a way that transcends that kind of mental, centrism that we have here in the modern Western world. It's listen to a song 5 times and repeat. I'll do it 5 times and repeat. It'll become part of you, right? My son loves the ants go marching on. Half the time I close my eyes, I start hearing the ants go marching on. Right? Jingle bells. Every time he sees a bell, jingle bells. They get. This is part of the rhythm, right? And it's a rhythm not just of thinking and reflection, but a rhythm of life, right? And what is one of the greatest, most foundational things to life? Eating and drinking, literally, how we keep our life going. And so we adjust the way and what we eat as part of this experience, So what does that mean? Does that mean that on Friday, I get they'll use me, the thought in my head, oh, we get to have steak tonight. God died today, I can't steak. Right? Sometimes I think that way, but it's become so ingrained, right? It's become so ingrained. But I had a friend of mine who was a professor at Fordham in New York, and he's kind of an odd duck. Every morning he'd stop by Whole Food, get a fruit shake and 1 strip of bacon. That was his breakfast. On Wednesdays, he'd just get the fruit shake. Fridays, just the fruit shake. And he told me once, he's like, in the middle of New York City and Whole Food, I have an encounter with God. I'm not eating the bacon, right? Because it just makes that present to So the weekly cycle, obviously, we have the resurrection on Sunday, Wednesday, Friday. Saturday historically has always been a day of remembrance of the dead. Right, the Sabbath, this is the day of rest, right? This is the day, most importantly, again, if we see Christ's life as that which shapes the calendar, both the weekly and yearly, that was the day that Christ rested in the tomb. And so we honor that event as well as remembrance of the dead. So really historically in Christianity, every Saturday and Sunday, there would be a divine liturgy. The Sunday only is a more kind of recent development. And it in no way took away from the celebration, the resurrectional joy of Sunday, but that if death has been destroyed, and we live in this continual relationship with those that are departed. And so we remember, we pray for them on Saturday while remembering also the victory of Christ over death. Within the day, there's also a cycle. This daily cycle is one that is more apparent kind of in a monastic setting. But the way that the Byzantine or the East Roman clock worked, for lack of a better term, was based on sunset, right? And so through the year, they would kind of adjust naturally, which seemed like so much more sense than losing an hour of sleep in the fall and getting an hour, right? It's a much more natural way of adjusting it. But at different times, you would remember different things. Monasteries typically, historically, would gather hourly, or at least at these primary hours. But the main hours that are remembered, we have the third hour, which again, depending on what time of the year, kind of corresponds to 9 a.m. And this is specifically in remembrance of Pentecost. Is at the third hour that the Holy Spirit descended. So 9 a.m. in Jerusalem. That's why people are like, "Oh, what have these guys been drinking?" It's a little early for that. Then the 6th hour, when Christ was crucified, and the 9th hour, when he died. The 6th hour again somewhat corresponds to noon. The 9th hour to 3 p.m. In monasteries, some pious lay people will also remember the 12th hour, or the midnight hour. And this again was something that was pretty common historically among Christians. They would get up in the middle of the night, do this midnight office, say these prayers. And those are specifically in reference or have the orientation of the second coming. Behold, the bridegroom comes in the middle of the night. And with all of these all these hours, there are certain parts of the Psalter, the Psalms have always kind of been the backbone of the Orthodox liturgical life. People ask, and I tell them, I think it's good if we can do little things to even as we live in the world, not in monasteries, we live in a culture that's very different from the historical Orthodox culture. You know, we can do things. We can say a prayer at 12 each day, thanking God for his sacrifice, for the gift that he's given us in this life. Bowing our heads at 9 o'clock, remembering that now this time Christ breathed his last before descending into Hades. So there's different ways that we can, I think, try to incorporate it. That doesn't necessarily mean going to your icon corner, opening the Book of Hours, reading the Psalms and prayers for them, but just these little remembrances. And like that rhythm, like that melody, it can become something that's just as natural as breathing, getting up, brushing your teeth, that sort of thing. So any questions about the weekly cycle or the daily cycle? So now we get into the movable, right? This is where it gets tricky, because everything that's part of the movable feasts has to do with Pascha, has to do with Easter. And so Pascha, 40 days after Pascha's the Ascension, 10 days after the Ascension, 50 days after Pascha is Pentecost. And our Orthodox service, the service we do before Divine Liturgy, and all the tones, right? There's the 8 tones. The readings, everything is based on this cycle, on when Pascha comes. And so this is where things can get a little bit difficult. The first thing we need to remember is Pascha, what we as Orthodox call Easter, the celebration of the death and resurrection of Christ, is the Greek word for what? Passover, right? Passage, right? The passage from death to life. And so there's a Hebrew precedent for it, just like there is for Pentecost. But this is where things get a little cattywampus, right? Because the Jewish people used a lunar calendar, right? The Roman world used a solar calendar, right? And so how do you get the two to fit? Not very easily. So how do we come up with the date? And I'll mention this and talk about why before I get into why it's different from or so often different from the Western Church. But the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox is Pascha. You get that?
Sunday, first Sunday after.
First Sunday after
full
the
moon
first full moon
after
after
spring.
the spring equinox. You guys get that?
So spring equinox,
Spring, yeah,
then at some point we get a full moon,
yeah,
then we.
Sunday after that.
after.
right. That's how the date of Pascha is determined. Now, it can get a little bit even more confusing than this, because the table that we use to determine when that full moon was, I think the last time it was updated was in like the 4th century AD in the city of Alexandria. The fact that they're right, like 99% of the time, is absurdly impressive. Right? But I don't know if you know, maybe I'm unique here, but sometimes I have a hard time telling you if it's a full moon. Like I get into little debates with my 2-year-old over it. I'll be like, oh, that's full. It can be fuller. It's hard to tell. And so it's not always precisely exactly right. And over the years, different things happen. I don't believe they were aware of the effects of precession, the wobble of the globe at the time that affects the way that we view these things. But essentially, that's the gist of how the Pascha date came about. Why did we make it so complicated? Why don't we just, it's been argued that the actual date of the, was April 4th. Why don't we just do April 4th every year? Why do we have to shift everything this immovable? I think this is something very, very important that we remember, right? In the ancient world, everything was seen cyclically, right? There's the daily cycle. The sun sets, the sun rises. There's the yearly cycle, the seasons, right? Everything kind of repeats it's no accident, I don't think, that most archaic religions, be it ancient Greece or India, had views of reincarnation, of cyclical ages. And this cyclical way of seeing the world, how it was kind of experienced in paganism, and I don't mean, the patchouli wearing, incense burning modern neo-pagans, but like the legit real pagans, was that everything was controlled by fate. Right? Even the gods, Zeus was bound by fate, right? There was no escape from these cycles. Right? Even Buddhism came along to say, okay, we got to get out of the cycle. How do we do this? Nothing. Right? At least that's a relief. Like, nothingness is better than this endless repetition. And so there's this idea that these cycles, they're part of that rhythm of life. The harvest, the moon, the sun, all these things. But at the same time, they trap us. Right? This movable feast, this Pascha, this Easter, then everything subsequently that's connected to it is not bound by that cycle. Is in a sense free. And in doing so, it has set that whole cycle free. That's no longer something of a slavery, but it's something that unites us to God. So instead of this snake eating its tail, that ancient image of this repetition of time, we have, like a spiral. We're going up, we follow it up. And it has as its center, Pascha, the celebration of Pascha. So there's Xavier Clement in his book Transfiguring Time is a really beautiful way of explaining this. And instead of trying to do it myself, I'm just going to read it. If Christ recapitulates human history, he also gives the cosmic cycles their full meaning. The fathers followed up on Philo's suggestion that all the cosmic symbolism of Greek religion could be assumed in the worship of a personal God. Seeing paganism fatally wounded and unable to break the new faith, they did not hesitate to give a Christian meaning to the cycles of nature. This has nothing to do with hyper-allegorical interpretation. It is the deciphering of the cosmic presence of the Lord, starting from the revelation of his personal presence. As St. Augustine wrote, the revelation of Christ is given to us as another world that allows us to rediscover the meaning of this world, of the first book of life. First and foremost, the diurnal rhythms, the paradisical nostalgia for the first sun at the first morning, the Egyptian symbolism of the midnight sun, the sun that never sets in the Upanishads. These are so many figures of Christ the Son, so dear to Eusebius, who saw therein the true victorious Christ of the Christian Empire. And so here it's saying this cosmic cycle is being fulfilled in Christ. Let's see if we can. The victory over death becomes victory over night. Night, which notably is not mentioned at the time of creation, is inserted in the fabric of time like an image of death. Like death, night has the merit of compelling man to renounce his semblance of autonomy and to abandon himself, to put his trust in sleep, to recharge his strength in sleep. You gave us sleep as rest for our weakness and as relief from its many sufferings from our tired flesh. Night is good, but also fearsome, the sign of the darkness of non-being introduced by man into creation. But Jews took the cross and went out once. Now it was night. By the resurrection in the heart of darkness, Christ has changed the meaning of night. Night has become the container of new light that knows no setting, of a luminous life freed from death. This is why now we have come to the setting of the sun, and behold the evening light, the hymn that we sing at every Vespers. We praise thee in voices of song. Physical night becomes, as it were, the mystery of the nuptial night, when the bridegroom, already secretly present amidst the darkness, drives it away so that we are face to face with perfect joy. The Christian cannot, for this reason, sleep like others in the unconsciousness of death or in the nightmare of passion. He holds vigil, and his vigil is eschatological. Behold, the bridegroom comes in the midst of the night, and happy the man who will be found waiting. And even when he closes his eyes, he prays that his heart will remain vigilant. Let my sleep always be filled with your presence, even when separated from the body, the spirit hymns you, O God. Yuletide, the winter solstice, is a crying out in the darkness, the exact moment at which light is dawning. The resurrection coincides with springtime. Through the symbolism willed for us by God, spring is the moment of the triumph of life, not merely for an ephemeral summer, but for the eternal summer of the kingdom. As Philo noted, the rebirth of nature at springtime marks the anniversary of creation, because according to archaic intuition, springtime renewal is in some ways an anamnesis, a remembrance of the cosmic spring of the original time of paradise. In order to remind us each year of the creation of the world, God has made the spring in which all is in bud and in flower. If spring is the moment of the world's creation, it must also be the moment of its recreation, by virtue of the sacramentality of cosmic time, because God does nothing that is empty of meaning. So we see how this cosmic cycle is in fact pointing us towards Christ. And talks about the new. When the Council of Nicaea banned the celebration of Pascha on the 14th of Nisan, so in the early church, Pascha wasn't always celebrated. Right? First full moon after the spring. It placed the primary emphasis on the opposite aspect of cyclical and lunar symbolism, what we have called repetition as a sign of hell. The moon was felt to be the queen of nocturnal terror and death, a diabolical Hecate. In fact, for the ancient Greeks and Hindus, as for many primitive peoples, the moon was considered to be the abode of the dead, and the world under its power, subject to endless cycles of the stars, was identified with the world of illusion and suffering. For Cyril of Alexandria, the devil, prince of night and darkness, is symbolically called the moon. St. Augustine, commenting on Ecclesiastes, writes, "What fool changes like the moon if not Adam, in whom all have sinned? The human soul, distancing itself from sunlight and justice, has turned all its strength towards the external, becomes more and more darkened. The luminous night of Pascha is symbolized by the lighting of candles, taking place as the moon is waning." So here we have that spring, and now the waning of this symbol of death. This symbolizes the abolition of the moon, the victory of Christ over the devil, over evil, and over death. Does that make sense? All right, any questions about the yearly cycle and removal and removal?
Do we offer this book in the bookstore?
I
Or do we
believe
have,
so.
or do we have like, because I've always been admired by the way like the math and Christ and how that's all kind of interrelated. So I just didn't know if we had a book in the bookstore.
Yeah, if you're interested in time,
Yeah.
and how the Orthodox Church is kind of sanctified both this image of cyclical time and linear time.
Right,
We in the modern West, as compared to kind of a Western Judeo-Christian view, have a very linear understanding of time, historical time as opposed to cyclical time. But both of them are understood as finding their meaning and their fulfillment in Christ. This is
transferring them, okay.
questions? Anyone wakes?
These are the tones.
Yeah. So, in the Orthodox Church, there are 8 tones, right? So each week, so the cycle of going through each week is 1 tone, right? So obviously, those are the tones. Yes, sort of. So there's a, so tone 1, for example, has a certain scale, a certain mode. Now, each tone has a lot of different melodies that are unique to that tone, that are repeated in different hymns. So it's I don't know if you're familiar with kind of the Greek modal system that was kind of adopted by the Renaissance. You might have heard something like the Lydian mode or the Aeolian mode. These are, I mean, most modern music actually fits in one of these modes. It's actually kind of fun to think about, like if, you know, like most hard rock is Dorian mode, which is kind of cool if you think like the Sparks, it's like Dorian. You know, most songs that like grab at your heartstrings are like the Aeolian mode. You know, so we're being affected by the same patterns in music going all the way back to ancient Greece. So it's similar to that. So there's a different scale, a different rhythm, different kind of rules. So there's 8 of these, right? And each one of these tones has its own set of hymns for every day of the week, right? And so, for example, Saturday night at Vespers, we started body or grave tone, or sometimes the 7th tone. So all of the hymns from Orthodox that were pertaining to the resurrection, and like the Boleticum, the main hymn that was chanted as we were going with small entrance, that was all tone 7 for the grave. And that'll continue through the week. And traditionally, like if you were to go to Greece, if you had like a professional chanter or really good chanters, everything would be, the priest would be doing the prayers in the tone of the week. The chanters would be doing, you know, every Sunday our Kyrie eleisons essentially sound the same, right? But it's
Because isn't like what's the chant that's during communion, praise the Lord from the heavens.
yeah.
And the highest, like that's usually like a different, I've noticed like.
Yeah,
every
so
Sunday it's like a
some of the
different-
chant, yeah, so I think that they'll do a few different ones.
So I'm like, this is not,
Yeah, a
sorry, I'm
little
really
bit
bad about
different.
this, but I'll be like, this is not my favorite tone, so like.
Yeah, I mean, and some of them too, like the minor key
Mhm.
will affect people from different cultural backgrounds a little bit differently. Yeah, let me give you a brief example. So this is Flagle of the First, or 5th tone. So you got some minors in there. That most people born and raised in America, it's very Middle Eastern sounding. And then we have the example of
Well, probably, I think we simply,
yeah. Why is the
wise,
because the first, really the first hymns of the church, apart from the Psalms, were Sunday morning, right? So they were all resurrection. And then from that, expanded hymns for the other days of the week.
And I don't know if this is a good question. So, cause you talked about the tones, like representing, like different. Or to having different, significances, right? So when we're going through, like when we're in the service and maybe there's like a different tone, are we supposed to be? I guess thinking or maybe feeling about something in a certain way, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm asking that appropriately.
Yeah, I wouldn't try to psychologize it too much.
That's my problem. Yeah.
Well, no, that's part of being American in the 21st century. We wanna,
So if you like asking for emotion, you're supposed to kind of adjust to.
Well, I guess I don't know if it's maybe emotions, but it's just, cause obviously it's very something holy that and
Yeah.
sanctified what we're doing and partaking in. So if certain tones are supposed to be representing certain things or maybe signifying things, like are we supposed to then
yes.
ponder over that?
No,
or-
I mean, I think in some cases you do have things like that, and the way that music works, I don't even think we have to be, consciously aware of it. Like when the chanter's chanting comes across the word Hades,
Mhm.
his voice goes flat. I bet you feel it, right? You think it.
Can you do that one more time?
And so I don't think we even have to be so aware of it. I think a big part of it too was just creativity, right? So it's not the same every time. To bring in these different things. I mean, some of the things that we are somewhat cultural, like for example, Lego of the second, that like a hard chromatic minor, that's gonna sound like really kind of depressing
Mhm.
to us with a more Western ear. But then you listen, it's Paschal, it's resurrectional, it's joyful. Because we kind of, the way that we interpret, I think, is somewhat cultural. So again, I don't think we need to overthink it. But then sometimes we catch up, we get little patterns, right? So the Lamentations on Holy Friday are Lego of the first, using the same skill that we use for Christos Anest. Christ is risen on Pascha. So, if you think about it, and I think you get this even without consciously thinking about it, already on Holy Friday, when we're mourning at the foot of Christ's cross and the tomb with his body laid in it, we're already getting an intimation, a taste of what is to come with the resurrection. So there's little things like that. A lot of these things depend on the skill of the chanter and the priest's ability to chant. As you just probably heard in my hayings, you're gonna miss most of it.
I just didn't know, because I mean, we're talking about the feast days and some of, their significance and representation, whether we should also view it in that way. Like with the homies and all that too, so.
Yeah.
It's just me.
No, I think it would be kind of nice, but I think again, music is such a cultural thing.
Right.
I think the important thing to remember too is that God could have made a world with only apples. But how many different kinds of fruit are there? And they're all awesome. Strawberries and blueberries and blackberries. But the fact that we can eat them and enjoy them is good to us. Right? God is a God of creativity and beauty, right? An almond tree, scientifically could procreate with 3 or 4 blossoms,
Mhm.
but it's kind of this overabundance, right? So I think the different tones is just part of that kind of overflowing abundance of beauty and creativity difference. And it's also people have different, as you hear the tones, people have different, there's some tones that I can't do. There's some that I like to do. My favorite tone actually, Bari, grave tone that we do today, is my favorite tone. I don't know if I've ever been able to actually do it. All right, well, thank you guys so much